Welcome to the Jay Martin Show. If you're new to the show, my name is Jay. I'm an investor and I'm looking for the best home for my cash. If that sounds like you, then I think you're going to like what we do here. Now, today's episode is a little bit different from what I normally do. Long-term viewers know I take a big picture, long-term view at things, and I never put out reactionary or responsive episodes, but that is what I am doing today. For context, it's late at night on Monday, October 9th. So just like you, I've been watching the horrific headlines come out of the Middle East since Saturday morning, and I'm trying to make sense of what's fact, what's fiction, what's real, what's misleading, what do I seem to know thus far, and what do I not know that I still have unanswered questions about. Now, my guest today is a very seasoned boots on the ground journalist named Jonathan Roth. And when I say seasoned boots on the ground, I mean he's found himself in many conflict zones throughout his career, including, for example, being on the ground in Zimbabwe, sitting down face to face with the dictator, Robert Mugabe. He's been on the Ochoa cartel's property in Mexico and countless more environments where most journalists would never dare to go. Now, today, I wanted to get his take because his network is exponentially better than mine when it comes to understanding the real events on the ground. His connections in government agencies and security agencies, both at home in the United States and in the Middle East, within Israel and outside, are really second to none. And so I wanted to get his take today. Normally, I would not share this conversation publicly. I would just call him to chat and get some perspective for myself, but I asked him if we could record this, and he graciously accepted. I did my best to handle this material delicately. I did my best to remove my personal emotions from the conversation and just dig at the factual information as best as we might know it as of today, knowing that everything we talk about may change in 24 and likely will 48 hours. Okay, let's get into my interview with journalist Jonathan Roth. Enjoy.
This is Jay Martin.
Okay, here I am with John Roth. John, thank you so much for making the time late at night. It's good to see you, man.
Jay, it's a pleasure to be here.
Okay, so immediately when I woke up to this news on Saturday about what was occurring in the Middle East, you're one of the first people I wanted to talk to. So here's what I thought makes the most sense today. You know my style. I like to focus bigger picture, longer term, and not get caught up in the weeds and the near-term events. Plus, there's 1,000 places you can stay up to date on current events. But to give this conversation justice, I do want to start with what we know thus far and kind of break down events as we understand them. So, what do we seem to know to be true thus far? And what don't we seem to know yet, right? What are some of the questions that you have thus far, given what you've seen occur in Israel, John? Maybe I'll just point to you and you can take it from there.
Well, it's clear that obviously Hamas infiltrated Israel somehow, in southern Israel in particular, from Gaza, went into this music rave concert that was going on early Saturday morning, and proceeded to massacre as many people as they possibly could. And I think everyone's seen the footage on Twitter and the footage that we're seeing on CNN and Fox and MSNBC and such. That's very censored from what we're seeing online. But it's clear that Hamas somehow, some way, was able to infiltrate one of the most technologically advanced military outpost regions in the world. There's no country like Israel that has security. I've only been there once, and let's just say that my experience there was security conscious to the extreme, which we could get into later on in the conversation. But it's clear from what's going on online, and even some retired Israeli intelligence folks, that there are a lot of questions about how Hamas was able to get in, and the delay in terms of how long it took police and fire and military units and such to respond to some of these incidents. In some cases, I heard upwards of 12 hours, which makes no sense. So I think there's a lot of questions about that. But obviously, they killed a lot of people. They've taken a lot of hostages, and the videos are absolutely horrific. And if Hamas wanted any sort of sense of solidarity from the average person that doesn't know anything or very little about this conflict, I'm not sure these videos help their cause. So at this point, that's where things are at in the southern part of the country. In the northern part of the country, it's clear now that Hamas or Hezbollah, which is a group up in headquartered in Lebanon, they are infiltrating down into Israel from the northern part of the country, and Israel has retaliated with artillery strikes and air attacks. That seems a little bit foggy in terms of how big that dispute is going to become. It's clear from what President Biden said, I guess about 24 hours ago now, that he basically alluded to the fact that no one should get involved if anyone sees that this is an opportunity to hit Israel because they're a little bit off balance, that this would not be a good idea. And he's also moved, I think it's the Jerry Ford, the USS Jerry Ford aircraft carrier group, strike group, into the eastern part of the Mediterranean. So I think there's a signal obviously going there. And I think the big question that hovers on top of all of this is to what degree Iran has been involved in planning this. And if so, to what degree is Israel going to do anything about that? So, and there are much larger questions that, you know, if you take a look at who Iran is allied with, in particular, there are a lot of bigger questions as to what's happening here, which we can obviously get into as the conversation unfolds.
So, as I understood thus far, and for context, because you know things will develop quickly, it's the evening of October 9th right now. So that's when we're having this conversation. Depending on when you're watching it, much could have changed. As I understood, John, you know, you obviously have a lot more connections in this world than I do, but the U.S., the Israelites, and the Iranians had all claimed that Iran had no involvement thus far. And it would make sense if Iran were to say that. But when Israeli intelligence and U.S. intelligence comes out and kind of affirms that, it struck me as odd. Did you hear that statement? Do you believe it? Have you heard something since? And what do you make of that?
Do I believe it? 100%. No, I don't. I don't believe it. I mean, look, maybe we could get into this now. It is my belief that we are in the early stages of the Third World War. Whatever that looks like, it is a lot different than maybe what we're used to in terms of what would happen in World War I and World War II. But it is clear that there, as the U.S., most definitely, no matter what American politicians and strategists want to say, the U.S. is shrinking from their global role. And that power vacuum is being filled by actors all over the world. And they're starting to do things that I don't think they would normally do. And of course, look, politically in the US, some people might say that's because Trump's gone and Biden's in there. He's viewed as a weak leader, and the Afghanistan pullout definitely showed that, you know, I mean, nobody was fired for that, which for the life of me, I don't understand. But it's clear that there are a lot of actors around the world that have looked at what's happening in the US politically and have said the US is very weak. And if we're going to start doing things, now is the time. And the U.S. reaction seems to be slow, if not, there's other words we could use, but basically the U.S. is not doing maybe what traditionally they might do, to drop a hammer on someone and basically say, back off. And I think they've tried to do that with Ukraine. Look, this gets into a bigger picture between COVID in terms of what happened there, whatever the story is there, and then what happened between Russia and China, remembering that just prior to that conflict, Russia and China essentially inked this deal that they were partners for life and publicly let it be known. And I know from some of my intelligence contacts that there were a lot of deals being done in behind the scenes, that it was clear to anyone, especially in U.S. intelligence, that Russia and China were aligned, you know, tied together by the hip, so to speak, in terms of what was happening with that invasion. So that invasion happens. It's completely decimated U.S. Material stocks. They simply don't have the armaments to continue to arm Ukraine, let alone maintain their position in Korea, let alone maintain their position in Japan, other parts of the world. So that's going on. And then at the same time, Israel has been, let's just say, pestered, pushed, cajoled by the Ukrainians, by Zelensky, and by the Americans to send weaponry to Ukraine. And Israel has not sent their Iron Dome system, which Ukraine asked for publicly many, many times, and privately many more times. But they have sent a lot of artillery shells and a lot of other armaments to Ukraine to help in their war with the Russian, and Mossad is even involved to a certain degree in what's happening on the ground there. So, look, it could be that we have Iran, China, Russia axis that have decided it is time to start taking on the U.S. and the European empire that essentially has built all the institutions that run the world. That could very well be what's happening, and they view it as a slow rollout. Nothing needs to happen right away, but they're clearly starting to push in areas that are going to stretch European power and American power to the breaking point. And I think we've already seen that in Africa with what happened with all of these coups that have gone on in mainly French controlled countries in Africa, Niger being probably the most infamous one that's happened here within the last couple of months. But what's pretty shocking for someone like me who spent some time in Niger is that the French, I mean, they didn't push back. They haven't done an invasion. They haven't, bombed anyone. They literally haven't done anything. They actually have decided to leave, and their ambassador left with his tail between his legs, and the French have done nothing, which I think points to the fact that to a certain extent, any sort of European hegemony anywhere in the world is over. And the Americans are the only ones left in the so-called West. So as I see it, I see that these various pieces are moving, but it's clear that there is one side on one side of the table and there's a side on the other side of the table, and one side is reacting to the other, which is why we're seeing incidents like the one that we've just seen here a few days ago.
So you answered a question that I had for you that was, how much of this would you think is a coincidence? Maybe that, after what you shared, it seems like a pretty juvenile question, but, to me, it's unclear. You look at the Russian invasion of Ukraine and this event, and it's easy to segment and say that this fight, it's a 2,000-year-old feud. This is its own thing. And Russia's fighting back for its borderlands. Those are completely separate events. You could make that logical case, right? And say, these each have their own unique and long-standing history. They're not related whatsoever, but the timing strikes me as odd. And what you just shared, you're saying this is not a coincidence. I want to, if I got that wrong, you let me know. All right. So I gotta pull back to something you said earlier, because you had a lot of skepticism around when you said somehow, Hamas was able to infiltrate the most technologically advanced border, one of the most military equipped borders in the world. What's the army in Israel ranks sort of fourth most advanced in the world, something like this.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to say that the Gaza Strip's, well, it's a pretty challenged place, right? I mean, it's essentially been under a quasi siege for about 16 years. Many parts of the Strip have power about twice a day. It's a bunker surrounded by borders they don't control, being Israel and Egypt. And so what's your take on that, John? Because you had a lot of skepticism, it seems like, from the fact that this invasion was allowed to occur and then the response time to it occurring, which didn't seem right to you. What are your thoughts?
Well, I mean, look, they obviously planned it very well. It happened on the Sabbath, right? So especially really observant Jews are not going to be doing anything on that. Some observant Jews don't even look at their phones, right? Nothing to do. Sure. No work on the Sabbath. So it happened on the Sabbath. It also happened on a national holiday. So to begin with, I think the typical radar that might be up would have definitely been pulled back somewhat. And at the same time, there's been, at least within Israel itself, it seemed like there's been no indication that something like this was going to happen. It's not like there's always been tensions around the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, which is another issue we could talk about here in a few minutes. But there's nothing that would indicate anything like this. Now, this said, there are some reports that there's an Egyptian intelligence official that AP was reporting, and I think it came from a newspaper in Cairo originally, that he had said that he had actually given the Netanyahu government a heads up that they were planning something big, to be ready, something along these lines. And I think the exact quote was something along the lines that Netanyahu seemed very disinterested in that. Which I find pretty hard to believe, just knowing the kind of guy that he is. But so we have that piece of the puzzle. We also have lots of videos out there on Twitter from retired Israeli intelligence folks saying, if there's a cockroach that moves underneath this fence, we know about it, right? So how could these guys blow a concrete fence and then cut through these wire fences and be able to get in there with that kind of speed? Right. There are some interesting, there's a really interesting angle to this in terms of communications, because I think a lot of people would have thought something of this complexity would have been monitored a long time ago. That there would have been some sort of a way that Israeli intelligence would have at least picked up on the fact just on online chatter, and if not them, NSA for sure. But it's already been put out there by David Goldman from Asia Times that Huawei, that all the phones and all the telecommunication devices set up in Gaza and being used by Hamas are Huawei, which means that telecom network is not able to be penetrated by NSA. So if you look at it from that point of view, obviously the Chinese would have an indication what's happening, and they probably don't care because there's no blowback going to happen on them about this. They don't care one way or the other. But from the Israeli side, they might have just been blind to the fact that they're using Huawei all the time. They're not necessarily adept at infiltrating those communication networks, so they just don't know what's going on. So there's that side of it. Look, there's been a lot of political turmoil domestically within Israel over the last 6 months, like tremendous domestic turmoil, the worst that's ever happened since 1948. That's basically over Netanyahu and some judicial changes that he wants to bring to the country. And that turmoil might have focused everyone inwardly, and they're simply not paying attention to what's happening with the Palestinians. And I think to a certain extent, if you look at the fact there's the Abraham Accords, then Israel normalized relations with UAE, right? With United Arab Emirates. And there's been all this talk over the last, 6 weeks that Israel was going to normalize relations with Saudi Arabia. So to a certain extent, I think the Palestinian issue has been on the back burner for quite a long time in Israel. So to what extent, and maybe, quite frankly, the signals that they may have been receiving might have very well been that, look, there's not a chance that they can mount any sort of, serious challenge to Israel. And, we don't necessarily have to worry about that. And the other side of it is that the leader of the PA is quite old at this point, the Palestinian Authority, and he's running the West Bank. And there's going to obviously be some sort of a power struggle when he passes away over the PA and Hamas internally. So to a certain extent, it could be actually that, they were looking, Israeli intelligence, Shin Bet, Mossad, whoever, were looking at all these issues and saying to themselves, look, we really don't have to worry about anything. We are focused on the outside. And even if they tried something, we would repel it very quickly and it would be over. And I think what makes this different, quite frankly, it is kind of small in the grand scheme of things, right? I mean, look, 1,000 Israelis, it looks like roughly, were killed in this attack. And it is a terrible loss of life. I do not want to discount that. And basically within 48 hours, they say there's something like 1,500 of these Hamas terrorists have been killed. And already it looks like Israel's really starting to hammer Gaza. So to a certain extent, it's over and done with. But the psychological damage and these hostages that are being held, I spoke with a friend, an Israeli friend this morning, whose next door neighbor is obviously also Jewish and was at this music event and has been taken hostage. So, just listening to her describe what's happening, it is awful. It is terrible. And that sort of a narrative and a story is going to supersede any sort of, whatever else is happening, because it is so terrible, the human side of the story, because every one of us, has been to some sort of a concert or an event, and we can only imagine all of a sudden out of the blue being taken hostage by bloodthirsty terrorists, which is, it is the worst Hollywood movie, that you could imagine, and it happened for real. So, I think the government was asleep at the switch. There's going to be political implications on that. It looks like they're trying to at least in the interim, have some sort of, joint government, unity government to get through this period of time. Because I think behind the scenes, they're definitely worried about Iran. There's a lot of things that could happen now that would put Israel on its heels in a huge hurry. And I think that's probably one of the reasons why there's an aircraft carrier strike group in the Eastern Mediterranean tonight.
Yeah. Okay. I want to talk about that. So first of all, thanks for recapping that. And it's good. I had to go there because obviously Twitter is just filled right now with people asking that question, saying this doesn't make sense. There's no way that Hamas just walks in like this and then response takes that long. And maybe there's something going on there, or maybe intelligence failures happen, right? If you think about, the whole West seemed pretty caught flat-footed when Russia invaded Ukraine very recently. Mm-hmm. Maybe that was or was not the case. The U.S. was caught flat-footed by 9/11, by Pearl Harbor. I mean, these things happen. I get it. In each one of those events, you can make a case that maybe, politicians knew more than the civilians did, but the civilians were caught flat-footed every single time for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Whenever something like this occurs, I always wonder, what are they thinking? Like, what is the true motivation here? Because the Israeli response is going to be swift and unforgiving. It's going to be very focused. And the Gaza Strip is like the third densest place on the earth in terms of population. Like, you can't really hit a target there without massive civilian casualties, and they're going to get hit really, really hard. And it's coming, And I find myself almost dumbfounded, John, where I'm like, what was the desired outcome of this? Because I only see one at this point, right? And it ends badly for the civilians in the Gaza Strip. So do you think am I missing a bigger threat? I mean, maybe you touched on it. Maybe there's another offensive coming from the north in Lebanon. I know that's going to be a big thing. But, in terms of launching an attack that on paper seems so fruitless, some early success for sure. Absolutely. But if you call that success, but the response is going to be decimation, is it not? And if not, what am I missing here?
I mean, look, at first glance, that's clearly what's going to happen. They're going to be utterly decimated there. I mean, the Gaza story is a complete nightmare, right? I mean, they were given this piece of, I mean, basically the Israelis, Ariel Sharon, when he was prime minister, who, if you know anything about him, he was, I mean, a very fearsome general, not friendly to the Palestinians at all. And many called him, he was a bad dude. He knew how to take care of business. But when he was prime minister, he basically, I think to a certain extent, offered a bit of an olive branch and said, look, we're going to give you Gaza. And to great political harm to himself, he forcibly removed Jews who were living there, right? And because it was a huge agricultural producing region of Israel at that time, pulled them out and gave everything to the Palestinians. And there's a very famous saying that the Palestinians never miss a chance to miss a chance, miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity. They missed it with Oslo, with Clinton, and they definitely missed it there, because I mean, that was maybe one of the best opportunities they would have had to have, like, they have this incredible agricultural production facility, here. And if they start making it, they're not going to be relying on international aid any longer. There's a lot of reasons to embrace this opportunity, and instead they went the other way. And so, look, what is this about? This is why I have a hard time. I mean, there are several geopolitical people that, if you talk to them privately, maybe think, not maybe, I know they do because we talked about it, think the way I'm about to speak publicly, is that these conflicts are part of a bigger master strategy in terms of trying to push back U.S. hegemony globally. And it is happening on every single front. You see it everywhere, right? And if you just take a look at what's gone on with the Ukraine situation, you take a look at what's gone on with even what China is doing with the U.S. right now. I had a conversation with an intelligence person last week, and he told me that they expect, this is a U.S. intelligence person, they expect at some point in the spring for China to make a move on Taiwan. That's their expectation. Of course, things could change, but right now, politically in Taiwan is definitely, looks like they're going to vote for the pro-U.S. candidate again. And the pro-Beijing candidate is not going to have any legs at all, in which case it pushes Beijing to make a move militarily. And so, look, that's also on deck here. So if you kind of go through all the different scenarios of what's happening in the world between Ukraine, between this and Iran, remember, Iran is arming Russia to the hilt with these drones, right? And to a certain extent, Ukraine has been a real testing ground for new types of weaponry. But Iran is very involved in what's happening there. And Iran does not want an agreement between Saudi Arabia and Israel. They do not want relations normalized, because at that point, Iran has they're in serious trouble at that point. They can't really mount any sort of offensive actions against Saudi Arabia or Israel, especially if they're joined at the hip publicly. Everyone knows that intelligence-wise, they've been sharing information for years, but to actually have relations normalized would be really not a good thing for Iran. So there's a lot of different factors that go into this, and that's why I would say that this attack, I can only assume, is part of a bigger effort that we may see unfold here over the next, few days or weeks. I pray to God it doesn't, but I think you could definitely see a scenario where Hezbollah starts moving in from the north and gets very aggressive. And you remember the last time that happened, I think it was around 2013, 14. It wasn't good for Israel. Israel did not, it wasn't a sure win. Let's put it that way. So if you have Hezbollah making moves there, if you all of a sudden have a situation where Iran starts moving their soldiers over to Syria, remember Iran's been backing the Syrian government, Bashar al-Assad, since the entire Syrian civil war that's still going on today. So if Iran moves troops there, they move down, remember the border with the Golan Heights is right there. Syria's bordered with Israel. And you all of a sudden you have Syrian and Iranian troops coming over that way. You probably saw it yourself. Even the Taliban announced that they're willing to fight, So if the Iranians airlift them over to Syria and they come down through, all of a sudden Israel has a very serious problem on 3 different fronts. And can they handle that much at the same time? And I think that there would be a very big question if they could. And if all of that happens and any of these other conflicts globally start to become just a little bit unhinged, I think you're going to have a situation where things really start to move quite quickly. And I think that's why there's obviously so much concern, because when you kind of pull out and look at the whole chessboard, it's pretty frightening.
I publish a weekly newsletter every Sunday. If you would like to subscribe, hit the link right beneath this video. Now, I'm an investor, but I don't write about managing money. I write about managing my mind. Without question, the hardest and most important part of allocating capital through volatility and getting some back. If you want to read my newsletter, hit the link right beneath this video. I know you'll love it. Now back to the interview. Enjoy. Okay, so you touched on Taiwan. There's a bunch of threads here I want to pull on, John. Right away, on Saturday when I woke up to this news, Taiwan was kind of my first thought. Because if you're going to put these things in sequence, then you start picking off the territories around the world that the U.S. has promised to protect, and you're going to put them to the test in some kind of synchronized fashion. And the U.S. has drained a lot of the resources supporting Ukraine, as you mentioned, including they had an armory reserve in the Middle East located in Israel, and a lot of that's been drained to support Ukraine. And I wondered, a couple times in the last 6 months, if the U.S. was playing their hand a bit too quick in terms of how they were reaching out aggressively to support Ukraine. I'm not making an ethics argument here. It's just resources are finite. Look at the energy situation in the U.S. right now. It's not pretty, right? Okay, so where do I want to go next here? So, what is the U.S. response at this point from your standpoint, John? And the U.S. can't fight a war on too many more fronts. But they're in a sticky situation because it's like you either step up and defend the places that you claimed that you said you were going to, right? And stand by your word globally. Everyone's watching to see if you're going to or not. But that means entering a war that you might not win, which is an even bigger risk, right? You got 2 poor choices in front of you. Which one do you think they take? I think I have an assumption here, but what do you think?
Look, you also have the U.S. domestic political situation that factors into this, right? You have an election coming up in roughly a year.
And here's election. If some percentage of Americans have no interest in supporting Ukraine, the number that have no interest in supporting Israel is far, far smaller. This is a war far closer to home, is it not? And the homegrown support for Israel, I would expect to be multiple times higher than any support that's been given to Ukraine. Is that correct?
Yes, I would 100% agree with that, for sure. People can't even find Ukraine on a map, but Israel, I think, there's at least, 60-70% of the American electorate still at least say that they're Christian, and in general terms, Christians tend to support Israel, especially evangelical Christians. So yes, I think there would be widespread political support across the aisle for Israel, no matter what happens in the U.S.
Okay, so believing that, then it's an inevitability that we know what the response will be. Is the biggest victim thus? I don't know how to phrase this question without sounding like an asshole, but is the biggest loser thus far in this scenario maybe Ukraine? Because if you now have to concentrate your available resources to defend and make a decision here, right? I think about the American public, and I think about sentiment, and I think about short-term election cycles, and how quickly previous crises get swept under the rug when a new one arises, especially when that new one is maybe a bit closer to home. And that seems to be what this is relative to the war in Eastern Europe. What do you think about that?
If there's a big loser, for sure, it's Ukraine. I mean, look, Ukraine is, that situation was already headed in a very, very, very negative direction for Ukraine anyway. And I think in Europe especially, I think the political will to support them is pretty much finished. Poland's made it public, but I think many governments, from what I'm hearing, are privately saying that conflict needs to end, and it needs to end yesterday. Just look at Germany's situation. There's, the country's being deindustrialized, right? So you have the chemical industry moving to China, you have the auto industry moving to the United States, and it's all about energy prices because, I'm sorry, American LNG is whatever it is, 4 or 5 times more expensive going across an ocean than coming through a pipeline from Russia. So I think there's a lot of angst within Europe that Ukraine situation needs to be wrapped up immediately. On the U.S. side, there still seems to be a lot of push to keep this thing going forward. However, it's also instructive to know that the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Milley, he just retired, and they now have a new one. And oftentimes personnel changes with policy changes with new personnel, because the old personnel simply can't, they're completely invested in this thing, and they simply can't back out. So the fact that there's a new chairman of the Joint Chiefs means that there might be a little more wiggle room to get around some of the statements that were made earlier by Milley about what should and shouldn't happen in Ukraine. So that conflict is clearly winding down, at least in terms of the Western support for it. You've probably seen the same things I have, and in talking to a couple of people, it looks like it's definitely going to be not a good situation for Zelensky when this whole thing ends. But and especially if Russia decides, if Russia's game is they're just going to sit back and wait and let Ukraine completely exhaust itself, which looks like, it has. And then they decide to really mobilize. I think they just announced another 150,000 soldiers mobilizing this fall now. So if they go ahead and do that and decide to actually do a full court press, it becomes pretty catastrophic pretty quickly. There's also word that the Poles may move in because there's a part of Western Ukraine that used to be part of Poland historically. So, there's a lot of ways that Ukraine could end up being carved up, but Ukraine is most definitely, they were already a loser in terms of where things were headed with that conflict, and they're even a bigger one now because, everyone is looking at this other conflict. And if this Israeli-Hamas situation, if it expands, Hezbollah joins, and or it takes a long time, as in it takes 2 or 3 months and pushes us to Christmas or even into the new year, there simply isn't going to be any political will in the U.S. to continue this Ukraine situation.
Okay. I got to pull back to something you said earlier in this interview. It was a pretty dramatic statement, and you hinted that we are likely heading into World War III. I need to get you to explain what that means to you at this point, John.
Well, look, if you look around the world at the way the world has been post 1945, that world is over. And the American generation that won that war, the greatest generation, my grandparents, they're all gone. And the baby boomers, they're all retiring. And, they're going to be retiring for another decade or so, but they're already a huge bulk of them. I think roughly at least over half of the boomers are already retired. They're out of the picture. So what's happening is and our generation is now the one that's going to assume the mantle and of global leadership in terms of running Western institutions. And I think you can see, if you just take a look around, that there are some serious problems happening in all Western countries. Not the demographic issue is completely catastrophic. That in itself is. It's funny because there's a very famous verse from Proverbs, which was written by King Solomon, reputedly the richest man who ever lived and the wisest one. But in Proverbs, he has this really interesting thing that he wrote, where he literally says something to the effect of, a growing population is a king's pride, and a dwindling population is a king's doom. And I think that is happening across every Western country: Japan, the United States, Europe, all the rest. And that's being replaced. I know in the U.S. there's always been this mantra that, it's okay, the U.S. still has the best population growth of any of the Western countries, but that population growth is coming purely from immigration. And the reality is that the levels of immigration are so high that how do you integrate this many people into a Western system that they were not necessarily brought up in? And is that possible, at least in the short term, long enough to push off civilizations that are clearly ready to push back? And that is China and Russia. And obviously they have their own demographic issues. China in particular has a lot of demographic problems, but they still have a heck of a lot more people than the United States does. So I think you start from that point of view, that the rest of the world, if you go outside of the Western bubble and just talk to anyone, in Africa or in Asia, and you talk to them about what's happening in Western Europe and in particular in the United States, I mean, I haven't met anyone that says, oh, the future is definitely in the United States. No one says that privately. No one does. Everyone looks at what's happening and says it looks like a slow motion train wreck. So if that's what the average person is saying, what do you think the politicians are saying and seeing, right, in terms of what's happening? So if they view that the U.S. is weak, which clearly with what happened in Afghanistan, the U.S. is viewed as weak, and that's why Putin decided to move when he did, and China was definitely 100% behind him, I think these countries view it as their opportunity to start taking some of this global leadership away from the U.S. And then you also have this other debt issue, which I know all countries have this debt issue, but the fact is the U.S. dollar is the global reserve currency. And you probably saw it yourself last week. Peter Schiff was talking about the fact that, if we just extrapolate out current interest rates with the current deficits the way they are in the U.S., and we push that out to, another, 15 years or 2035, something along those lines. I mean, you're literally looking at a situation where half the federal budget is allocated just for interest payments on the debt. I mean, it's impossible. This is not going to work, right? There's not a chance. The current path that the West is on is unsustainable and simply will not work. Canada, same situation. These pension plans are all going to blow up. So if you are China and Russia and Iran, countries that feel deeply offended by the way that they have been treated by the United States in particular, and the Western world in general over the last, especially over the last, let's say 50 years. And China in particular has a very strong, their 100 years of humiliation sentiment that's within the country that views, the opium wars, which we're not educated on in the West. But if you take a little bit of a glimpse into them, you'll find pretty quickly that it's not pretty for Britain. And the United States to a certain extent, with what happened with the opium wars. And then there was this century of humiliation that ended when the Chinese communists took power. But tens of millions of people died in the civil conflicts that were happening within China, with a lot of foreign interference. So Japanese invasions and such. So these countries have a bone to pick, and we're not necessarily aware of these historical grievances. And because to a certain extent, many of us, we live in this technological world and we're not necessarily attuned to the way the rest of the world thinks about their own history. Because the truth is, even our own history is somewhat, we can't remember what happened yesterday because we're scrolling so fast on our phones to see what's happening, today, tomorrow. We're not thinking about yesterday. But these other, especially civilizations that still retain a lot of that history and culture, they don't like the way they've been treated. So there's a grievance there, and I fear that grievance is coalescing into something where you have Russia, China, and Iran, coming together in some sort of axis that says, look, the West is weak, and if we're going to make a move, we're going to make it now. And it's clear that they're making that move. And quite frankly, a year out from the U.S., the most, politically, domestically divisive election that's upcoming, this would be the time you would move. Right? If you were them, you want to move when the politics in your adversary are so convoluted that they might not be able to get their act together in time to defend themselves. So I fear that that's where we're going. I mean, look, could cooler heads prevail? They most certainly could, but I don't see any statesmen or stateswomen on the scene right now that make me think that a deal is possible. Of course, you look at what happened in World War II. Would anyone have guessed that Churchill, would have been the leader he turned into, and that Roosevelt would do what he did? So I think sometimes history is what creates great leaders, just the things that happen. But we're clearly heading into some sort of maelstrom right now, and let's just say, looking at it objectively, Russia's leadership and China's leadership, although they have a lot of problems, they definitely seem to have goals. Whereas Western leaders, quite frankly, they're interested in social engineering and not a heck of a lot else. And they need to get focused on things like are happening in Israel, happening in Ukraine, and potentially happening in other places like Taiwan, and things that could spread all over the world. They need to buckle down and focus on what's important right now.
You touched on our short-term memories and our lack of, frankly, history in the West, and specifically in North America. And it also makes sense to me. Yes, we're scroll nation now, and so that is the case. In addition, we think about history in the context of our history, do we not? And so how could we understand, 1,000-year history of 2,000-year history of Russia, of countries in the Middle East, when our history is a couple hundred years old? It's like that almost doesn't exist to a lot of Americans. But over the last 600 years, we've had Portugal's been a superpower, Spain's been a superpower, the Dutch have been a superpower, the UK and USA. And that's 5 cycles within 600 years, inside of 600 years. And when you look at it from that standpoint, you're like, yeah, it's time to pass the buck. Like, that would be normal. It would be normal to pass the buck. In addition, during that same 600 years, you mentioned, a few very powerful Chinese and very advanced Chinese dynasties. During the end of empire, you typically see the same 3 things. You see a government that gets over their skis because they become, they came from maybe poverty, they became wealthy, they became decadent, they became indebted, and that fueled decline, right? That's a cycle, and that's an insolvent nation. And then usually within that cycle, you see a ton of civil unrest, and usually born out of wealth disparity and a massive and increasing wealth gap. You can tick both those boxes in the United States. And the third thing that you often see is then you see the external conflict or the rising powers or power. And often it's not one power, it's a few that kind of rise up and challenge the existing power. And you can tick all those boxes right now very clearly in the United States. I mean, just that one internal cycle of like productivity fuels wealth, wealth fuels decadence, decadence fuels debt, debt fuels decline. I mean, that's a natural empire cycle. And you tell me where we're at right now in the West, right? It's very, very obvious. My hope is that even though I think we're in the declining years of the American empire, that somehow this will be civil. I mean, I'm like, how could this be a civil ending? And you think, oh, well, London's still a great place to visit, even post UK empire, so is Madrid, so is Amsterdam, so are these places. But the years of decline were not so pleasant, as we know,
Mm-hmm.
And when you made a comment about leadership in the West versus leadership in the East. And look, I'm not making a bet or I'm not complimenting autocracies in any way, but if you're going to categorize Eastern leadership as weak or strong relative to Western leadership, weak or strong, it's like, oh my gosh, it's embarrassing. It's embarrassing. Very much so. It's a bunch of virtue signaling, 2-year election cycles, no vision, and a complete failure to unify the people. 100%. Any thoughts on that?
Look, I mean, Jay, you nailed it. I mean, it, like you, I certainly don't support autocracies, and I certainly wouldn't want to live in either one of those countries, Russia and China in particular. But if you just look at their leadership from, outside at what's happening, they certainly seem to have their act together a heck of a lot more than what we have, in Canada or the U.S. And in Western Europe in particular. I mean, how many prime ministers has the UK had just over the last 5 years, right? I mean, it's becoming a joke.
Right.
So that said, I mean, look, China has a lot of internal problems at the upper levels of the Communist Party, right?
Sure.
there are definite issues there, and there's Putin had some sort of a coup that was a coup or not coup, whatever the heck it was, right? And yet at the same time, we have, what happened on January 6th, which was, I wouldn't categorize it as an insurrection, so to speak, but it was definitely an indication that the political situation in the United States is tenuous. And I was in Washington, D.C. the day that Trump took when he was inaugurated. And I have to tell you that experience, ever since then, in 2017, January of 2017, it has informed a lot of my thinking, because I have never seen protests and violence associated with the inauguration of a U.S. president like that ever before. And that ever since then, I've been thinking, this is not a country. How are they going to hang together here? And I know historically, U.S. has had a lot of problems, and they're always able to sort it out. And the way the system is set up, it seems to be able to let off steam in appropriate places. But the system itself is being broken down just by legally what's happening right now with former President Trump. I mean, I think anyone, if you ask them honestly what's happening with all of these indictments, are they political, or are they, is this real? I mean, it's political. There's not a chance any of these things would have happened if he was not going to run. But because he's running, they're going to try to throw the book at him to prevent him from being on the ticket again. So this is unprecedented. Never seen this before. So yeah, I mean, the U.S. needs to get their act together. And there are some people think Robert Kennedy is the right person. Glenn Youngkin's a very interesting guy. You should keep your eye on him. But the governor of Virginia, who used to be CEO of Carlyle. But it's the U.S. needs some. I mean, look, maybe they need a slap in the face to wake up a little bit. Maybe that needs to happen.
But who do you slap? It's like
currently,
Yeah. The problem I see with this is, like, you could find the right leader. I think they may exist, and maybe they're raising their hand, and maybe they're saying the right things. But the population's at a point where it's just not going to resonate. The population's not focused on that. The population's focused on pronouns and just, I mean, I could go on. It's just ridiculous. And so you could find that visionary who could cut a path, right? Cut a civil path through the declining years of empire. I mean, that may be the best case scenario, probably is, but let's shoot for that, right? But that person likely exists. And it's just, how are they possibly going to rally support in today's world when you look at the civil unrest and the civil divisions and the internal conflict? It's like, forget leading the U.S. externally. It's a dumpster fire internally, right? And I'm up in Canada. I feel the same way about Canada right now. And I got 3 super young kids, and I'm not sure where I should raise them, frankly. And I've talked about this on my channel many times. We hold Canadian and U.S. passports, but we're also putting down roots in Southeast Asia just for optionality. And I'm trying to be nimble and agile. And it comes back to that. I've never felt like pride. I don't feel proud of being Canadian because I had nothing to do with it. I'm proud of things I accomplished, right? I didn't draw the lines where the borders are. I was just born here. So I feel really fortunate and really lucky. Absolutely. Every single day I feel blessed to have been born in a country where I was surrounded by opportunity and choice and predictable, safe governance and all this stuff. But if I think forward, okay, so I want to put my kids in that scenario and my grandkids, then I got to think, where will I find that 30 years down the road, 40 years down the road? And will I find that here? And I want to say yes. And I feel like if I can lean in and help contribute to that becoming a reality, I want to do that. Simultaneously, I want to take care of my pack. And I'm looking outside and saying, maybe there's a better place for us, though. And I don't know. Now, you got kids, John. What do you think about that? What do you think about that, trying to make those decisions and think about the future in terms of, like, okay, there's volatility always. And I think the 2020s will be like the 2020s have been. Continued unprecedented uncertainty and chaos, unfortunately. And that's proving true. But I'll still bet long all day on human ingenuity and progress over the long term. But what do you make of that? 20, 30 years, you're a father. What are your thoughts, John?
I have not thought out, say 30 years from now. This is off the top of my head. I will say it's clear that we're going through some sort of a similar, realignment similar in some aspects to what happened when the printing press came out, right? That the printing press completely, between the printing press and the Reformation, the Protestant Reformation, all of a sudden, information that was relegated just to a few became available to the masses, right? And that completely upended everything. They read the Bible. Martin Luther was like, here, you can read it yourself now. And they read it and they're like, why are we paying you priests so that we can be absolved of our sins? And like, this doesn't make sense. It's not even in here. You guys are getting rich off, you made this up. So in many ways, the same thing is happening now with this internet revolution that started in the mid 90s. And then the social media when it came around in 2007, 2008. I mean, look at what's happened in 15 years, the social changes that if you would have told me, I was in university, in the mid 90s, if you would have told me what we're talking about now in terms of the social engineering that's going on, no one would have believed you. Even the furthest to the left, individual that I, went to university with would have never believed you if you would have said, some of the issues that are happening now. So, where this goes another 20 or 30 years from now, you have to assume that some sanity is going to be pulled back into the system, if only because the system cannot continue on if there isn't sanity, if there isn't some sort of family structure that raises children appropriately, despite the fact that there's a video out there in a company that says they're going to, basically manufacture babies in test tubes and raise them and all the rest. That's not around yet. It might come, but we're from everything that I've heard and read about it, it looks like we're 2 or 3 decades away from even the distinct possibility of that happening. Right. So at least until then, where do the people come from? Families have to raise them. And I think we're already seeing with some of the social unrest in terms of what's happening in many of these inner cities in the United States, where many of these young men were raised without fathers. And, if you have 70% of the black population doesn't have a father at home, well, you're going to get young men acting out. You simply are, because the old man isn't there to, drop the hammer on him and say, smarten up. That's not how you should, treat a woman, or, you shouldn't be stealing or doing this or that. So I think we're literally seeing what happens when you disintegrate the family structure. And the question is does that family structure get somehow rejuvenated over, I frankly, some of the reactions to what's going on everywhere. And I think in some places you're going to see more of that than others. At the same time, we also have this overarching global internet structure that is being built that is incredible in terms of its potential, awe-inspiring in terms of its potential, but terrifying in terms of the downsides. And that global internet structure that is companies like Facebook and Google, and in China in terms of what they're doing with WeChat and such, these companies are basically becoming governments in a way. They're far more powerful than at least 7 or 80% of the governments on Earth today. So where are they 20 years from now, where they can sway, if we have a democratic election, they can sway the election one way or the other. So the question is, to what extent do human beings want to live in an environment where basically we're being pushed by algorithms into a certain box? And I, honestly, like you, I kind of bet for the humans in the long term there, because, no matter what happens, I think we'll figure it out. I think it's going to get really messy, unfortunately, because we're in uncharted territory, and there will always be people that want to rule other people. And that has to get sorted out, exactly how that's going to work. We're seeing that battle right now, right, with Bitcoin and CBDCs. Which way is that going to go? One promises, quite frankly, a pretty wide open world, and the other one promises the potential for a very terrifying world. So I think a lot of these issues are going to be sorted out, and just judging by the history books that I've read, I think it's probably going to get. It's not going to be easy, but I think you just have to tell yourself that there's nothing new under the sun, as the saying goes, and you just have to prepare and be ready to take whatever comes your way.
Yeah, and you hit on you hit the printing press analogy, which I think is super timely, because in a lot of what you share, this is the time where information that was previously only available to a few was suddenly available to the masses. I mean, we're experiencing that now. People are asking the question, or they were asking it back then, why are we relying on the priests to give us this information? It's the same question people are asking today. Why are we relying on government agencies and certain organizations and lobby groups to make our decisions for us, right? It's very similar. It's remarkably similar. And it struck me because I had breakfast this morning from a good friend of mine who works at Canaccord Genuity, and he was just in Toronto at their annual conference. And one of their keynote speakers was former Canadian Prime Minister Harper, who I've had on my show a couple of times. And he drew that same analogy. And he said, look, most often, the first politicians to really get a handle on the new communication technology are complete yahoos, and they cause all kinds of chaos and division. But then eventually some more accountable, responsible politicians figure it out, or leaders, figure it out. And they are able to leverage those same technologies in a more organized or responsible fashion. I don't know if there's something there, but it sort of made sense to me. I was like, yeah, it's obviously no coincidence that civil unrest has skyrocketed in parallel with adoption of everybody being a media agency. I mean, that's where we're at, right? At this point, right? Everyone's can play media if they want to. And one of the hardest things about this situation in Israel is determining like how much of this footage is actually occurring in Israel. So like, we've seen so much of this in the past when conflict erupts, and there's footage from previous unrelated conflicts repurposed and then a narrative attached to them, posted on social media. And it's very difficult to dissect like what's actually authentic, what's actually happening on the ground here. Unfortunately, most people don't ask that question. They scroll, they see, and then they recommunicate, and they just pass it on. Or it is what it is. I am hopeful though, because I am feeling myself like I'm having a much higher appreciation of traditional conservative values over the last like maybe 4 to 5 years. I don't think that's just because I became a father 7 years ago, and now I have 3 kids. Tends to make you a bit more conservative when you have more accountabilities. But in general, when I start moving a certain way, thinking a certain way, I'm not unique or an early adopter. I'm part of a trend. I'm part of a wave, and I am seeing a bit of a wave of young families migrating back, maybe from a couple decades of more secular mindset towards something deeper and more meaningful. And because there's been something missing, maybe that thing is what unites us, and that hasn't existed for a while. And there's a real value in finding that spiritual alignment that my family is seeking now, and revisiting and reigniting in our life, which has been lovely. But it provides us a strong foundation, and that foundation has not existed largely in the West, and we've been walking away from it during the the age of science, which has also been beneficial, but comes at a cost.
Yeah, look, I'm in complete agreement on all those points. There's definitely there is a sense that the only way we're going to get out of this is to embrace some of the values that we've had in the past, right? That we've thrown out, that we've decided that science is the only way, and I think we're already seeing with some of the policies that are happening all around us. If COVID wasn't the first thing in terms of the way it was rolled out, and I mean, look. Are there very many people out there today that actually still have any sense of trust in government agencies after everything that happened with COVID? No matter what side of that issue you're on, it seems like government's definitely screwed up, right? And I know they were rushed trying to make decisions, but there were a lot of mistakes made. So, yeah, look, I'm optimistic for the human race. We're still going to be around for a long time, but things are accelerating very, very quickly, and it's an exciting time to be alive. And quite honestly, I feel blessed that I was raised in the time that I was. I was born in the mid 70s, and I grew up in the 80s and the 90s, and to a certain extent before that internet culture hit really, right. So I had that, pre-internet culture, and now I'm in it, and I remember what it was like back then. And to a certain extent, at least in North America, I know a lot of other places you talk to folks, and it was very difficult to live. But the truth is, we were very wealthy in North America in the 80s and the 90s to a certain extent, especially compared to the rest of the world. And now we're entering into a period where we're going to have to buckle down and get through this turbulence, which it's already here. But we can get through it. We can figure it out. It's interesting what Harper said about these communication technologies and how Yahoos often get a hold of them first. We'll see what happens with virtual reality. Whoever gets hold of that first, but. Although I do want to check out that sphere very quickly. Maybe we're all going to have spheres in our basement eventually, but in Vegas. But yeah, it's clear that there are a lot of changes happening very, very quickly, and people are trying to hold on to something. So, for the Christian West, right? I mean, the reason we're called the West is because the church split in two, right? When the Eastern Orthodox went one way and the Western world went a different way, right? So I think even we have these words we use and we don't even understand the history behind them, right? That we're still using them. And I think there are people that are starting to sense, hey, where did we come from? Where are we going? And these values like free speech and democracy and freedom of assembly, all these issues, these are issues this is a hill I'm willing to die on, because if we don't have those, then what do we have, right? We're literally ruled by, totalitarians at that point. That's where it's going to go. So these issues, I think these battles are going to, unfold. And obviously in Canada, there's a lot of issues over the censorship bills and such. But, there are politicians on the scene that are like, if we get elected, we're going to revoke it completely. So there are a lot of positive developments because a lot of people are waking up to what's going on. I just hope that everyone wakes up in time.
Yeah. Oh man, John, this has been great having you on, and thanks for making the time, late at night to come and chat to me on short notice, by the way. Much, much appreciated. And I know a lot of this conversation, I'm not going to sugarcoat, it's hardcore subject matter. There's a couple hot wars occurring that are likely to expand. So I don't want to apologize for having a darker episode here, because frankly, it's dark material, and there's people that are really suffering and in the most atrocious and horrific scenarios that I never want to find myself, my kids, my wife in. And so, I don't want to apologize for having a dark episode, but, maybe to leave it on this note, like when I say I'll bet all day long on human ingenuity and progress, I mean, the human journey has been one of volatility, absolutely, but it's also been one of improving life conditions. And when we get knocked down, like we swing back, we get back up, and we will always get back up. And I know that I get back up. And so if I know that if I'm going to do that, if I'm going to keep fighting for a better life for my immediate family, once again, I'm not unique. I'm not a first mover. There's a wave of people just like me who are going to do the exact same thing. And no matter what happens, they'll get up and fight for a better life for them and their family. And, I'll leave it at that. John, I really appreciate your time, brother. It's been great chatting with you tonight, and love to do this again soon, man.
Absolutely. Thanks for your time, Jay.
Thank you for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed this conversation. Now, if you want to take the next step, I publish a weekly newsletter, and it's free. There's a link to subscribe right beneath this video, and you can join me and 50,000 other investors weekly for this exclusive content, where I share my key action items and takeaways from conversations just like this and plenty others. Thanks for stopping by.